Story number 1.
The Whistling Man. Small towns always seem quiet, but in the town of Ashgrove, quiet wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. No one walked the streets after dark, and no one dared to whistle. Lena had moved there for work, renting a small house near the edge of town. She thought the locals were just superstitious until one night she heard it. A whistle. It was faint at first, a single high-pitched note carried by the wind. Then it shifted, growing louder, weaving into a strange, haunting melody. Lena frowned, peering out her window. The street was empty. The next morning she mentioned it to her neighbor, Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman who seemed friendly enough. "You heard him?" Mrs. Harper asked, her face draining of color. "Him? Who?" Mrs. Harper hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "The Whistling Man," she whispered. "You hear the whistle, you lock your doors and stay inside. Don't look for him, and whatever you do, don't whistle back." Lena laughed nervously. "You're serious?" But Mrs. Harper didn't laugh. That evening, Lena tried to shake off the warning. She told herself it was just a local legend, a ghost story meant to spook outsiders. But as the clock struck midnight, she heard it again. The same eerie melody, drifting through the stillness. She froze, remembering Mrs. Harper's words. Her hands trembled as she locked the windows and bolted the door. The whistling grew louder, closer, until it seemed to circle the house. Then came the knock. Lena's heart stopped. It was a soft, deliberate tapping on the front door. She tiptoed to the peephole, her breath caught in her throat. No one was there. The whistle started again, this time from the back of the house. Her curiosity got the better of her. She crept to the back window, pulling aside the curtain ever so slightly. A man stood in her yard. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. His body seemed to sway slightly, as if in rhythm with the haunting tune he whistled. Lena stepped back, her pulse racing. The man's head snapped toward the window. She didn't see his face, but his movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on tangled strings. The whistling stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it pressed on her chest. Then she heard his voice, low and rasping. "Whistle with me." Lena clamped her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The noise seemed to enrage him. The whistling resumed, louder and more frantic, and the walls of the house seemed to vibrate with the sound. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the line was filled with static. Desperate, she hid in the closet, her hands shaking. The whistling stopped again. Then came the scraping, a slow, deliberate drag of something sharp against the walls. "Whistle with me," the voice repeated, now directly outside the closet door. Lena squeezed her eyes shut, biting her lip to keep from screaming. The door creaked open, but when she looked up, there was no one there. The next morning, Mrs. Harper knocked on Lena's door, but got no response. The police found the house empty, though the walls were scratched and the windows shattered. The only trace of Lena was a single note scrawled hastily on the back of a receipt. "Don't whistle back." That night, as Mrs. Harper locked her doors and settled in, she heard it, the faint sound of whistling just outside her window.
Story number 2.
The Shadow in the Well. The old stone well behind the Peterson farmhouse had been dry for decades. Surrounded by weeds and half covered with a rusted metal grate, it was more an eyesore than anything else. The locals called it cursed. When Mia and her family moved into the farmhouse, they dismissed the stories as small-town superstition. "They say a girl fell in years ago," their neighbor, Mr. Collins, told them. "They never found her body. Just be careful." Mia, a curious 12-year-old, was drawn to the well. She wasn't afraid of old stories, but she would soon wish she had been. One warm evening, Mia sat outside reading while her parents worked inside. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when she heard it. A faint sound, almost like someone calling her name. "Mia!" She looked around, but the yard was empty. Then she realized the sound was coming from the well. Peering through the grate, she could barely see anything in the darkness below. "Hello?" she called. Her voice echoed back to her, followed by silence. She told herself it was just her imagination and hurried back inside. That night, Mia dreamt of the well. In her dream, a shadowy figure climbed out of it, its long, bony arms reaching for her. When she woke up, she swore she could hear whispers outside her window. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Mia's dog, Max, refused to go near the well, barking and growling whenever they got close. Her younger brother, Toby, started having nightmares about a black monster. And Mia herself couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. One night as she lay in bed, she heard it again, the voice calling her name. This time it was louder, clearer. "Mia, come to me." She tried to wake her parents, but they brushed it off as a bad dream. Frustrated, she grabbed a flashlight and went outside to prove something was wrong. The night was eerily still, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. As she approached the well, the whispering grew louder, overlapping voices urging her to come closer. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing claw marks etched into the stone around the well's opening. Her hand trembled as she lifted the grate. The darkness inside the well seemed alive, writhing and pulsing like liquid shadow. Then she saw them, eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly from the depths. A skeletal hand shot up, grabbing the edge of the well. Mia stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The beam illuminated the figure climbing out, a gaunt, shadowy creature with elongated limbs and a twisted grin. It spoke, its voice a guttural hiss. "You freed me." Mia screamed and ran toward the house, but the creature was fast. It darted after her, moving unnaturally, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. She barely made it inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature reached the porch. Her parents found her crying and shaking, but when they looked outside, there was nothing there. "I swear," Mia sobbed, "it came out of the well." They reassured her it was just her imagination, but the next morning they found the back door scratched and the well's grate twisted and broken. That night, Mia refused to sleep in her room. She stayed with her parents, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, echoing through the house, until even her parents couldn't deny something was wrong. By the time they decided to leave the farmhouse, it was too late. The creature came for them one by one, starting with Toby. When the police arrived days later, the house was empty. The only sign of the family was the well, its grate repaired as if it had never been touched. And if you stood close enough, you could hear faint whispers rising from the depths. "Come to me."
Story number 3.
Curse the room that wasn't there. When David and Clara moved into their new home, they thought they'd found the perfect place. The Victorian house was charming, though a little worn, with creaky floors and high ceilings. It was their first night unpacking when David noticed something odd. The house had 4 bedrooms according to the listing, but they could only find 3. "Maybe it's a typo," Clara suggested, "or a storage room we haven't found." David shrugged it off, but the thought nagged at him. That night, as they lay in bed, they heard faint knocking, slow and deliberate. The knocking came from the far wall of the hallway, where the missing room should have been. David inspected it the next morning, running his hands along the wall. The wallpaper felt thicker there, and when he knocked, it sounded hollow. "There's definitely something behind here," he said. Clara was hesitant. "Maybe we should leave it alone. If it's sealed, it's probably for a reason." David wasn't convinced. Armed with a crowbar, he began peeling away the wallpaper and prying at the boards beneath. By evening, he'd uncovered a door. The door was old, its wood warped and splintered. It had no handle, just a keyhole shaped like a jagged star. "What kind of key fits that?" Clara asked, staring at it uneasily. They searched the house for hours, but found nothing that could unlock the door. That night, the knocking returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Clara woke to find David sitting up in bed, staring toward the hallway. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. She nodded, her chest tightening. "David, I think we should leave it alone." But David couldn't. The next morning, David went to a locksmith, who laughed when he saw the shape of the keyhole. "I've never seen anything like that," the locksmith said. "You'd need a custom tool, and even then, I'd be careful. Old houses sometimes hide things for a reason." Ignoring the warning, David returned home and decided to break the door down. With each swing of the hammer, Clara felt a growing unease, like the air in the house was thickening. When the door finally gave way, they found a room coated in dust. The walls were lined with black peeling wallpaper, and the only piece of furniture was a small wooden chair in the center. But what caught their attention was the writing scrawled all over the walls. The words were messy, overlapping, as though written in a frenzy. They said things like, "Don't stay," "It watches," "Close the door." And above the chair, in large jagged letters, was a single word: "Sorry." Clara shuddered. "David, we need to seal this back up. Right now." But David was transfixed by the chair. He stepped closer, and that's when he noticed something on the floor beneath it. A dark, reddish stain. That night, neither of them could sleep. The house felt colder, and the once distant knocking was now accompanied by faint whispers. Clara woke in the middle of the night to find David missing from bed. Panicked, she searched the house and found him standing in the doorway of the hidden room, staring at the chair. "David!" she called, her voice shaking. He didn't respond. He slowly turned to her, his eyes wide and unfocused. "She's still here," he whispered. From that night on, David became obsessed with the room. He spent hours sitting in the chair, staring at the walls. Clara begged him to stop, but he seemed detached, like a part of him was slipping away. And the house itself grew more sinister. The shadows in the hallway stretched unnaturally long, and the whispers grew louder, repeating the same words over and over. "Stay, stay, stay." One night, Clara woke to find the bed empty again. This time, when she went to the hidden room, the chair was empty too. But David was gone. She searched the entire house, screaming his name, but there was no trace of him. Finally, she returned to the hidden room and saw something that made her blood run cold. The word "sorry" had been crossed out, replaced with new writing. "He stays." The door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural. Clara fled the house that night, never looking back. When a new family moved in months later, they never noticed the faint knocking in the hallway. At least, not at first.